So I think for today's video, we're going to do a little something fun and put together a retro television cart. Hello everybody! So as of recent, there has been some slight changes to my storage rack of CRT televisions. Most notable for some of my longtime viewers out there would be the addition of this classic 1980s Sony Trinitron located here among my various 19 to 20 inch tubes on the right half of this wall. This was a recent pickup for me at the 2025 Retro World Expo, which took place here in my home state of Connecticut back in September, and I think this spot that I've chosen for it here would make for a fantastic location to store it when the television is not in use. However, for those of you who really know me, you might be wondering what has happened to the television that had previously occupied this spot here. The CRT in question would be this guy, my beloved Panasonic CTH 1900 from 1986. This tube has certainly been featured quite a bit in the past here on my channel, only because, like I've stated before, I simply adore this television and consider it to be my favorite CRT in my entire collection. But wait, you might ask, if I've recently replaced it with that Trinitron here in my storage rack, well, what is to become of that woodgrain knobby Panasonic? Oh, don't you worry, I am certainly not parting ways with that tube. I'd sooner ditch nearly every other tube in my collection before I let go of this one right here. Rather, I've felt that with its previous storage location in the rack, I've never been able to use it as frequently as I would like to, and so I want to change that today by giving it a much more accessible and, well, rather period-correct entertainment center of sorts, where I would be able to use it with much more ease than before. So for today's video, I thought it would be fun to show you how I've assembled this, a straight out of the 1980s rolling television cart with my lovely Panasonic as its centerpiece. Now, of course, I'm no stranger to this concept, and I've made use of rolling carts as a means for displaying and using some of my other favorites from the collection in the past. In fact, some of these have appeared before in some of my past videos, such as the various carts that have occupied this little space here in my game room. Putting these television carts together always makes for a fun little project for me to do, and I think assembling one that really matches the aesthetic of this Panasonic CRT would be a stellar solution for allowing me to enjoy video content on this wonderful screen more frequently. Alright, so to get us started, let's talk about the item which really ignited this entire project, this vintage television cart, which I think was a very fortuitous recent thrift store find for me. A few of these things have passed through my hands over the years, but this particular cart I really find myself liking. I really enjoy the overall shape and size of this fine example, and I believe it should suit my plans quite well here. So, curiously enough, on the top shelf of this cart is a few rather interesting labels. Fun fact, this cart is actually UL listed, believe it or not. And then on the larger of these two labels, we have a list of a bunch of different Zenith CRTs that are claimed to be compatible with this specific cart. And no doubt, the designers of this cart intended for some of the feet underneath some of these Zenith sets to index with these two holes that are drilled into the top shelf here for some added stability. Now, sadly, my Panasonic CTH 1900 isn't one of the televisions listed on this label here, but during a test run, the TV still seems to sit just fine when placed on this top shelf. And, of course, I certainly do not intend for any roughhousing to take place around this setup, so I think everything will still be fine even if I do take this risk here. However, with this cart, there is a larger risk that I do feel would need to be remedied before we begin loading this thing up with some AV equipment, and that would be the lower shelf here. So, I don't know what it is with these vintage television carts and the absolutely pathetic particle board shelving they made use of in their construction, but this panel here has definitely seen its fair share of weight over the years. Now, the upper board that holds the television itself isn't that bad at all, surprisingly, but this lower shelf here certainly is too far gone to be safely used with really anything at all. In fact, it's not even difficult to cause this shelf to collapse without even any weight on top of it whatsoever. So these long grooves in the wooden crossbeams are all that hold this panel in place, and even with everything as tight as it could be, all it takes is a simple tap on the surface and this piece just falls right out. Honestly, it's truly baffling how flimsy this design is. So, for some context, if I were to make an estimated guess based off of the particular models of Zenith televisions that appear on that sticker up top, I would say that this cart hails from the late 1970s through the early 1980s, and, well, that era certainly wasn't known for their featherweight electronics. You would assume that someone would want to put a component such as a VCR on this bottom shelf here, but as soon as you bring in my gargantuan RCA VET 180 from 1981 into the picture, the idea of putting a monster like this onto that pathetic bottom shelf just becomes absolutely laughable. But as much as I would like to maintain the original look of this television cart, we're gonna have to think of a better solution for this before we begin putting anything on here. And this is the solution that I came up with. After a trip to the hardware store, I came back with a sheet of this wire rack intended to be used as closet shelving. And after using some bolt cutters to trim it down to the proper size, I think this idea will end up working splendidly here. In order to properly secure this wire shelf to the cart, I'm using this lip, which would ordinarily serve as the front of the shelf for its intended purpose, as a means to sort of grab onto the rear wooden crossbeam. Conveniently, this also results in the thick metal wire that makes up the opposite edge of this shelf to index perfectly with the center of the front crossbeam as well, of which I simply rotated 90 degrees so that the groove which originally held onto the particle board shelf now points upwards. With this groove pointing in this direction, the horizontal wire seats perfectly down into it, which adds quite a bit of stability already, and with some added zip ties to anchor the back part of the rack directly to the crossbeam, the end result is substantially better than that total joke which originally formed the surface of the bottom shelf here. That panel from before would cave in under the slightest breeze, but even with this aggressive manhandling, this shelf is now rock solid. Honestly, it's quite remarkable just how well this wire shelf ended up working as a retrofit for this cart here. Really, the only negative that I can think of regarding its use is that the sterile white color of the wires doesn't really match the vintage look of this cart as well as it could, but of course, I could always run some experiments in the future by repainting it to something that coordinates much better. I'm thinking a brass or a bronze color will really help blend this entire thing together nicely. But for now, even as it is, I think this new wire shelf will make a substantial improvement to the functionality of this cart. And with that, I'd say it's about time we start loading this thing up with some AV equipment. Now, of course, we are totally going to need a VCR in this setup, so I think for this cart, we're going to go with this Panasonic PV8455S model. Funny enough, this tape deck is actually a bit of an anachronism here, considering it will probably be the newest component in this entire cart, having been manufactured in 1998. However, I think that the aesthetic still fits here, and there are a few reasons why this particular VCR wins out over a few of the other contenders that I considered for this role. Certainly, I would love to use that Titanic RCA Selectivision that I showed you before in the setup here. However, unfortunately, this brick is barely functional as it is, and could absolutely go for a complete overhaul, for I would even consider using it on a regular basis in a setup like this. Now, don't get me wrong, it would be stellar to include this classic VCR in what I have planned for this cart here, but really, I just want to watch my tapes, not constantly battle with the machine that plays them. Now, if I would rather opt for something on the far opposite end of the spectrum, I would probably go for something like this lovely Panasonic DMR EZ75VP combo unit. Functionally, I would certainly have the upper edge with this, given that it also grants me the ability to play DVDs as well. However, given that this particular combo unit was manufactured in 2004, and certainly looks like it was manufactured in 2004, I think the post-Y2K aesthetic of this machine is just a bit too new for usage here. No, for what my intentions are with this cart here, I think that this rather typical mid-90s VCR will still suit my needs just fine. And thankfully, we won't really be missing out on much, since there are a few key features of this VCR that still make it just as functional here in my setup. However, I'll go over what these features are after we get everything else connected and powered up. For now, let's load up the rest of the gadgets that I plan to include in this TV cart. Next up, of course, we are going to need an original Nintendo Entertainment System here. Honestly, I would think it would be a gross crime not to include one of these consoles in a setup like this, but even though it natively supports composite video, and the console modding community has made extracting a quality RGB signal from this machine into a trivial matter, I still feel like the NES is one of those game systems that is the most enjoyable over a plain Jane RF signal on a curved picture tube. But as for the second game console for this stack, here might be a bit of a controversial take for some of you. Now, while ideally it would make logical sense to include an Atari 2600 within this available space here, I actually think I might go with something else instead. Now, of course, I still adore the VCS, and there's a good reason why this console is the one that still endures to this day among all of the other machines of the second console generation. However, while yes, I do like playing some games on my 2600 on occasion, I never really spend too much time with Atari's machine to really justify including it here. It's fun for 10 to 20 minutes of gameplay every now and then, but that's really all that I do get out of it with each play session before I decide to move on to something else. For this cart, I want to make sure that I include a device that I intend to spend a good amount of time with, and naturally being that I grew up a Sega kid, it comes as no surprise to those who know me best that I'll be putting a Model 1 Genesis here in this spot instead. This is without a doubt a console that I can easily spend many, many more hours of my life with, and of course, why wouldn't I want to enjoy some of my favorite Genesis games on my favorite television whenever I want? And lastly, to fill out this little bit of extra space atop of my front-loader NES, how about we also include this flip clock radio here as a bit of a functional accessory to this retro cart. I love these types of clocks, and I would say it's even more appropriate for me to include this particular one, being that it was also manufactured by Panasonic, considering both the VCR and the TV itself come from the same company as well. Additionally, there is one rather accidental feature regarding this particular flip clock. It turns out that these little nubs that act as the clock's feet on its underside are both the perfect size and position to grab a hold of that characteristic strip of ribbing that runs across the top shell of the original NES. In a way, these nubs help lock the flip clock in place on top of the NES, while still maintaining enough space to interact with the console's cartridge door. But anyways, now that we're done loading things onto this bottom shelf, it's time for the main attraction. We, of course, are now going to top this entire stack of retro goodness off with my 1986 Panasonic CTH 1900 CRT television. I wouldn't be surprised if some of my longtime viewers might be saying to themselves, geez, this guy really never shuts up about this thing. But if you're perhaps joining me for the first time here today, yeah, this one definitely is my favorite out of the entire collection, and putting it here on this cart gives me all the more opportunities to enjoy it. Alright, so with all of those components loaded up onto the TV cart, we're now going to start connecting everything together. So we're first going to start out, obviously, with some electricity, and for that, we're going to be using this power strip from Lowe's in-store brand Project Source, which is a particular favorite of mine for these kinds of applications. There are multiple design elements about this specific power strip that I find make it ideal for TV carts like this. Things that I really like include the horizontally positioned outlets, the two widely spaced outlets on either end for connecting large power supplies, the through-hole mounting points, which makes it very easy to anchor to the cart with either screws or zip ties, and the 10-foot cord length, which in turn gives me plenty of reach wherever I decide to park the TV cart. And even if I don't need that full run of power cord to make it to a wall outlet, it's just a simple matter of wrapping up the excess with a cable tie. If you're ever on the lookout for a good power strip to incorporate into a rather compact rolling cart like the one that I have here, and are able to manage just fine with only two wide-spaced plugs for the wall warts of your AC adapters, I can absolutely recommend these ones, which are sold at Lowe's. In fact, I have a second identical one of these serving the same exact job in my other TV cart here, which is home to my Samsung GX TV. But now that we have power running to everything in this stack here, next up is to make our AV connections. And here is where the RGB purists leave this video in disgust. We will be connecting everything to this television via good old RF. Yep, time to shove not only the Luma and Chroma components of the video signal down through a single wire, but we're also going to slap the audio band on top of that as well. But this television only has a single RF input on it anyway, and regardless, the theme we're going for with this TV cart is nostalgia, not absolute image clarity. If I really wanted a pixel peep at some NES and Genesis games, I have far better solutions in my collection that are much more suited for that purpose. So we're going to start the signal path down here with the VCR, and we're going to be getting the AV signal out of it by using the F-type coax output located on the rear of the deck. Now, for connecting those two game systems, while there are certainly other options for providing a switcher or mixer for the RF signals from each of these consoles, for this cart here, I'm actually going to be going with the bone stock approach and use the original RF cables that would have come supplied with the consoles from the factory. Now, I'm going with these just because I know it will work just fine for use in my home, but some of you who happen to live in an environment that is much more noisy with other radio signals might fare better in a setup like this by running some thicker wires, which contain much better shielding within them. However, for me, my cable runs here are going to be tremendously short, and there isn't too much in the way of RF interference within my home to begin with. And as for connecting everything, well, simply just run this short coax jumper from the output on the VCR into the antenna in port on the NES RF switch, then send its output into the same input on the Genesis switch, and finally send that box's output up to the television. Now, ordinarily on televisions of this vintage, one would have to make use of one of these little doodads called a matching transformer as a means for connecting video gear to these antenna inputs. However, what's really nice with many Panasonic sets from this era is that they include this little pass-through loop of coaxial cable right below the terminals, and simply by pulling this side of it out of the socket, we now have a standard F-type connector that we can screw our input cable onto. And that's exactly what I'm going to be doing here, although I am also going to add one last little piece in between these two cables, which would be this quick disconnect adapter. This additional piece in the line makes it far easier to work with anything that uses these kinds of connections, being that it eliminates the need to screw these cables together, a feature that will come up in just a little bit. I'm also going to be using one more adapter in this signal path here by attaching this coax to RCA adapter onto the antenna input on the rear of the VCR. Some of you might already be able to guess what the reason for this is, but again, I'll get to that in just a minute. And for the final finishing touch, despite the fact that these are just going to be a vestigial piece of decor here since the analog tuners in this television set can't pick up broadcasts any longer, a TV like this still absolutely needs a pair of rabbit ears poking out of the top of it. Down the line, I could actually put these things to use by incorporating a digital tuner box in this setup, but for now, this antenna is just here for the aesthetic points. And with that, we're done. So let's turn this cart around and see if everything works. All we have to do is just plug the power strip in, fire up the Genesis, main screen turn on, and we get signal. Excellent. Honestly, considering how relatively convoluted some of my other AV setups have been like in the past, especially when it comes to my more permanent TV stands that often include a good handful of connected components running a variety of different display formats, it's quite refreshing having such a simple setup like this here where the most troubleshooting I would need to do would probably take me under a minute to solve. And just to be sure that everything is working, next we'll see if we have connection with the NES. Yep, all is good here as well. And lastly, we'll toss the tape into that VCR and see if it will play. And once again, everything is peachy keen. Sometimes it really is quite a nice feeling when there really isn't all that much which could possibly go wrong when putting together something like this. Since I have it outputting video now, I'll show you one of those things about this VCR that I really like too. This is completely just for the vibes, but I really enjoyed the classic big blocky text that this machine has for its OSD. This is the kind of tape aesthetic that VFX artists go to great lengths to try to replicate, but it's just so cozy seeing the real bona fide thing being generated by the actual hardware right here in front of me. Really, the goal for this entire TV cart is simply just to be cozy. This really is the magic that keeps drawing me back to this display technology, and specifically to televisions from this era. It is why I am so enamored with this Panasonic CRT that I have here. Yes, I also own tubes which will run circles around this thing with their image clarity. Even some of the ones located in the background of my footage here will easily give this lowly 80s RF set a run for its money. However, I feel that many of the great tubes that we were blessed with towards the end of the 90s and through the first half of the aughts also, in a way, sterilized some of the charm that really could only be found on a CRT of this vintage. The wood grain, the tuning knobs, the soft image, even just the bubble curve of the picture tube's face just puts me there in that wonderfully comforting headspace. Okay, I know. I need to stop myself before I just ramble on here like I normally do. Getting back to the topic at hand, I want to bring up a few of the other features that I've designed into this TV cart, which I've alluded to a bit earlier in my video. First up, I want to address the other added benefits that this VCR brings to the party here. Obviously, any videotape mechanism which has the ability to record will include some inputs so that you can feed video into the machine, and this Panasonic unit here is no exception to this. However, as I'm sure that any of you who grew up around this stuff are well aware of already, one nice little side effect of having these connections on a VCR, which we can exploit here, is that these could also serve as additional inputs for the television. Remember that little RCA adapter that I screwed onto the antenna input of the VCR? Well, now we have a very simple means for connecting that Atari 2600 to this television without ever having to heavily modify the signal path that we've built already. I think this solution works far better than just trying to shove literally everything I would intend to play on this TV into this cart here. And of course, this also means that I'm not just limited to using the VCS here on this input. That RCA adapter is compatible with pretty much every game console that has their own hardwired RF cable, which includes nearly every system released around this same generation. Swapping my 2600 out for something like this ColecoVision takes all of a minute to complete, and again, this same connector works just as well with consoles like the Intellivision, Odyssey 2, most Pong consoles, and more. Technically speaking, even some of the game consoles that came with their own RF switch boxes, like what's in use here with my NES and Genesis, can also be easily swapped into this AV stack. The branding on those RF cables means absolutely nothing, and they function exactly the same way no matter what the console connected to them is. All I have to do is just unplug the RF cable from my Genesis here, and I can use that same exact cable to hook up something like my TurboGrafx or Atari Jaguar. However, what gets even better is that by means of that composite input on the rear of the VCR, I am also able to feed any composite video signal through it and up to the television as well. Really, this VCR is essentially pulling double duty by also doing the same work as one of these standalone RF modulators would do, on top of being able to play my tapes. Pretty much anything with support for composite video can be attached here, which can definitely result in some rather anachronistic situations if I get creative enough. This is also why I'm not all too upset about losing out on having access to a DVD player here, since the inputs on this VCR turns the task of temporarily connecting one into it a trivial matter. All in all, for such a simple TV cart that I've assembled here, I think I've managed to build in a surprising amount of flexibility regarding what kinds of content I would be able to enjoy here. Oh, and also, remember that quick disconnect that I included along the signal path to the television? Well, this also allows me to very easily swap out the television itself, just in case I feel like giving another one of my woodgrain televisions a go on top of this cart here. Even if it's challenging the brand loyalty on display here in my setup, that 80s Trinitron from before certainly looks right at home sitting on this top shelf as well. Since my current game room lacks the space that I wish I had to allow me to have some of those lovely vintage tubes set up in a more permanent manner, I think having this cart makes for a fantastic solution to allow me to get some use out of these classic old CRTs. But I'm sure much to the disappointment of some of the die-hard Sony fans out there, while again, I still intend to occasionally rotate this lovely Trinitron in and out of this cart along with the rest of my 80s sets. It's really this heavenly Panasonic that will be calling this cart home for much of the foreseeable future. I just like it more. And as anyone who has ever tried to accurately film a CRT knows, it has always been a difficult task to capture on camera just how good this particular tube looks to me in person. It's truly excellent for what it is. Honestly, I think its image looks ever so slightly better than that Sony from before, and that one was very recently professionally refurbished as well. Even if we ignore just the sheer image quality though, everything about this television as a whole just feels so comforting to me. I guess you could say that what I'm really trying to get at here is there is still a lot of fun to be had with many of these older, less capable CRTs that predate some of the really nice models from the 90s and 2000s that are the ones that are highly sought after now. It's actually been pretty nice for me getting to see the trends regarding collecting and using tubes in the modern era evolve over time. Originally, people flocked to CRTs simply for that it was the best means of viewing analog video content in our new digital world, hence the grailification of PVMs that we saw leading into the tail end of the 2010s. However, within the past few years or so, it certainly seems like many have been seeking out this technology not for the image quality, but simply for the charm and aesthetic one gets when watching content on a tube. Personally, it's a delight for me seeing the new generations of enthusiasts who never even grew up around a CRT who are now looking to experience it for the first time in their lives. And as an enthusiast myself, I'm hoping that these trends continue. I know that the little kitchen television is currently the hot topic as of late 2025 here, but never mind cozy kitchen TVs. The cozy bedroom TV is really where the good vibes are at. And maybe seeing my little retro corner here will help shed some light on how awesome and enjoyable something like this still is. Trust me, there is nothing like tossing a comfort film on VHS onto this screen here when I'm lounging in bed on a cold, rainy day, or even when I'm just getting some chores done around the house. Plus, being that this cart is on wheels and I've got that long power cable running out of the back of the power strip, that easily allows me to move this entire stack anywhere I'd want around my home with ease. Again, the convenience and flexibility of my build here will really help me enjoy my favorite television more frequently and in so many different ways. And really, that is the main point of my video here today. Many of my own projects have been the result of me gaining inspiration from someone else, and I'm hoping this little project that I've put together on camera for you here could serve as inspiration for you too. I'm sure that every one of you that are my age and older would be able to assemble something like this with their eyes closed, but I included the assembly process because I also want to be equally as welcoming to those who are just starting to dip their toes into this hobby and are looking for ideas for what they'd like to do with their first CRT. And maybe some of the tricks that I've incorporated into my TV cart here might even benefit some of you more experienced tubers out there as well. But that's pretty much it. So I've been loving the end results here, and it's been a joy for me being able to use this television again on a much more regular basis now that it's always ready to go right on top of this retro TV cart. I hope that you've had fun getting to see the process of putting all of this together, and hopefully this will inspire you to give some love to some of the old televisions in your life as well. Again, even though this tube might not be giving me the sharpest RGB video possible, like what some of my other CRTs are capable of, there still is a lot of fun to be had with some of these classic woodgrain sets from the 1980s, and spending time with everything I've included in this cart here has been just as enjoyable as ever for me. But in the meantime, I thank you all again for joining me for another episode of Steve's Assorted Stuff. And if this kind of content is enjoyable for you, please stick around because there's certainly more to come. But until that next time, as always, have a great day, everybody.